King Henry VIII, when seeking a divorce from Catherine of Aragon, was motivated by one important factor. He did have an heir. She had given him Mary Tudor, but it wasn't thought proper at that time to have a female heir to the throne. Having recently come through the tribulation of civil wars, it was thought that a female heir would not lead to stability of the realm. We saw crowds this weekend in the days that have transpired since our sovereign's death. We saw tributes pouring in from all over the world. Indeed, the French President Macron said that to us, she was our queen, but to the rest of the world, she was the queen. It's fair to say that she did more for the stability and indeed the reputation of our monarchy in the Commonwealth and here in the United Kingdom than anyone could have possibly imagined. That's the difference between man's wisdom and God's wisdom. You see, King Henry VIII was viewing this as a political and possibly a military question. But for our late Queen, there were more important things at stake than merely the earthly and the so-called stability of the realm. You see, our late Queen, it seemed, was viewing the matter of the monarchy as a duty, firstly before God, and then to her many subjects. I don't think it's a stretch to say this morning that she saw it as reflective of God's good and eternal rule as far as we are possibly able to feel that. And I think I give voice to many of our feelings this morning, and even as a former Prime Minister remarked this week, that I did almost feel as though Queen Elizabeth had an eternal capacity. She was there for so many of our lives. She was there at important points in our life. She was there through multiple generations as Queen for so many of our families. But today we must also acknowledge that as much as that felt to be the case, that she was mortal like us. But we have cause for celebration because as the Queen was living her life, she did something important that we read about in our text in Ecclesiastes this morning. She remembered that there was something more important, even than national security, than personal pride, than personal or even institutional legacy. She remembered her Creator. Why have such a message and such a service today? Well, there's many reasons that it's appropriate to let our thoughts be guided by the reign of Queen Elizabeth this morning. Our nations in Scotland and England have a long intertwined history of monarchs. The monarchy had an important relationship with our denomination, the Church of Scotland, as those of you who were watching the Ascension of King Charles on the television yesterday will have picked up on, as certain oaths and acts were read out, which specifically mentioned us. Further to this, Her Majesty was actually a worshipper within the Church of Scotland while at Balmoral, so in a real sense we have lost one of our own. Speaking biblically, it is fit and proper to give thanks when the Lord shines on us with wise and good and gracious rulers. And above all, this morning, we give thanks to God for one who actually knew him, who knew the Lord personally, who had a deep and enduring faith, which was her guide all her life. Why think about the book of Ecclesiastes? For many of you, it'll be an obscure book in the Old Testament. It is certainly a hard one to understand, and I don't think anybody fully does. But it is a book with a message that transcends any one age in this earth. Many things change in our world, but in so many ways, we as humans do not. Like the monarchy, the message of Ecclesiastes passes from one generation to another and has relevance because of the way we are. Ecclesiastes defends the life of faith in a good and a generous God by very starkly considering the alternative. What is the alternative to having hope and faith in a good God? Well, it was read out in chapter 12. Meaningless, says the preacher. All is meaningless without faith in a good and a gracious God. The preacher, who is the author of Ecclesiastes, who we don't exactly know who he was, he wears the cloak of one who has surveyed a lot, like King Solomon, one who has had the benefit of seeing life from all kinds of angles, one who's had the benefit of seeing everything that this life could throw in terms of pleasure and enjoyment and even temporary earthly security. And so he sets himself the task of collecting sayings, of getting the most objective and well-seasoned and well-traveled viewpoint that he can possibly get in order to impart some kind of wisdom in these pages, which he clearly hopes will be eternal wisdom to guide all of us in times of plenty and in times of scarcity, in times of trouble and in times of ease. Our Queen lived under many gazes. In a real sense, she lived under the gaze of all of us. As I alluded to in speaking to the children, she didn't actually choose the life that was given to her. She responded to the call as an act of service. She, as a little girl, had no such designs on being the ruler of our nation. But through the abdication of Edward VIII, she was thrust into the line of succession at just age 11, which forever started to change how she saw herself and the kind of things she had to learn. And then, as many of us know, and some of us remember, on the 6th of February 1952, on the death of her father, King George VI, she became sovereign of the UK and Commonwealth countries at just aged 25. But she was the first monarch to do this under such an intense public gaze. Many of us will have heard this week about the rush that there was in that year to go out and buy television sets. Many of you, I'm sure, will remember in gathering around a television set, whether your own, a family member's, a neighbour's, who had perhaps even just rented one for this magnificent event of being able to see a coronation. It's one of those seminal television moments that stands out, a bit like the moon landing, which in many ways stays in our memory but has forever changed our relationship to those in power. We now expect to have television access. And so she lived under the gaze of so many. In many ways, she was a television era queen, in a way that future monarchs will have to negotiate being social media age monarchs. In this last week, receiving the resignation of an outgoing prime minister and confirming the appointment of her last one, she had a dedication to live well under that gaze that she fulfilled up to the very last moment. She didn't shy away from that gaze, that scrutiny, indeed the accountability of being seen by so many simultaneously at the same time, and having to conduct one's life in a fit and proper way that is commensurate about that. And so I want to ask this morning, what did she know? What had she gleaned from her study of the book that we have just been reading that enabled her to do that so well? The historian Dan Snow remarked this week that the Queen that has just passed was easily in the top 5 monarchs that we have ever had in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. She had the longest reign and she conducted it in an exemplary manner. But how? And how was she guided? I would like to put to you this morning that she knew her Creator and remembered him as central to all that she did. You see, in Ecclesiastes, the word creator is plural. It speaks of a heavenly majesty that is so great, it's as if there was a great multitude looking down upon us. The sheer force of the majesty is something that the preacher is trying to get across, that we might live in light of the solemnity and the greatness of that. These verses are about teaching us to remember that mankind must not only look to their own well-being, but to remember that they are living before their Maker. The fear of God is a phrase that is used in this and in other wisdom books in the Old Testament. It is said to be the cornerstone and the foundation of wisdom. And we read that as modern people and think that the fear of God is perhaps at best mysterious, but at worst is irrelevant and an outdated way of speaking of God. Rather, I think it's something we could do with rediscovering. The fear of God simply means to recognize His unchanging power and His justice. And it's an important thing to base our lives upon, because there is many benefits living in the fear of God. To recognize that there is a power above us that is unchanging from age to age, from era to era, that is more enduring even than any monarchy. It does a couple of things. Firstly, it helps us in our morality. There are so many things, so many questions about what is right and what is wrong. Should we turn to the right or to the left? Those questions become often much simpler to answer when we remember a Creator and we think that we are living life in light of that. But also this understanding of the fear of God, of contemplating His greatness and majesty, it delivers us from self-conceit. It delivers us from self-righteousness. Because however good, however great and noble and worthily we may live, we are always reminded that we are doing it under the gaze of a holy and a perfectly good God. There is a weight to living under the fear of God, which I believe Her Majesty was able to grasp. On the coronation of Elizabeth II, C.S. Lewis, the well-known author of the Narnia Chronicles, wrote these words. You know, over here, people did not get that fairy tale feeling about the coronation. What impressed most was those who saw it was the fact that the Queen herself appeared to be quite overwhelmed by the sacramental side of it. Humanity, called by God to be His vice-regent and high priest on earth, yet feeling so inadequate. As if He said, in my inexorable love I shall lay upon the dust that you are glories and dangers and responsibilities beyond your understanding. Do you see what I mean? One has missed the whole point unless one feels that we have all been crowned and that coronation is somehow, if splendid, a tragic splendor. I think Her Majesty grasped the weight of what it is to live in the fear of God and to seek to conduct oneself in a way that is commensurate with that. The author and broadcaster Charles Moore said that it's possible that Her Majesty was praised and flattered more than any of us and anyone we know. She would have been flattered and praised from her earliest days, from the days that we saw her in photographs right up until the last. And it's impossible to think of anyone else who has lived such a public life, such a long life, who received such a volume of flattery, who so utterly managed to prevent it affecting her. Her view of herself or her view of her duty. You see, the fear of God delivers us from self-righteousness, self-conceit, from needless pride, and orients us to live before the face of God. The flattery, the praise, the pomp and circumstance did not go to her head because she knew her head, her sovereign, was the Lord Jesus Christ. She knew that reverence for the Lord, and it gave her perspective. Ever since she wore that unimaginably heavy crown for the first time, with both the symbolic and the real weight of it bearing down on her, she, in the preacher's words, remembered that it was under the gaze of the Creator she truly lived, not just her television sets. And she aimed to live in light of that. You see, remembering in the Hebrew Bible is more than just giving mental or intellectual assent to something. It is more than remembering us. We must remember what we do from day to day, or our shopping list, or whatever it is we associate with that word. For the Hebrew authors and first readers of the Bible, it was bringing one's whole being to meditate on, take note of the significance of something, which is what she did. And that is why we have so much to remember her for today. I put to you that she remembered her Creator, and that informed her whole life. But the preacher gives us a couple of instructions. It says to remember the Creator in the days of your youth, but he also summarizes a question that in many ways we're all asking. Why are we here? What is the whole point of life? And many voluminous works have been written about that. In religion, in philosophy, even in the modern world. There are many theories on what life is about, why we are here, and what we ought to do with that. And unapologetically, I hold up the preacher's words as divine instruction from the Lord God this morning. But to fear God and to keep His commandments is the whole duty of man, and it's a life which has many benefits and blessings. On Her Majesty's 21st birthday, during a Commonwealth tour, she pledged via a radio address, I declare before you that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family, to which we all belong. And we have to say that she was extraordinarily gifted at this service, but she also worked hard at it. She saw her life as a public servant, and part of that role was to put people at ease wherever she found them. Almost everyone I meet has some story, some connection with Her Majesty, whether directly or whether through relatives or friends, or the opening or some ceremony that took place near to them, or perhaps even some grand ceremony they were fortunate to take part at down in London. But almost uniformly, without fail, the verdict is the same, that she was remarkably down to earth, and that she put me at ease, and that she was good-humoured. I think she did that, and I think she was like that as an outflowing of her knowledge of God. You see, so often religion, Christianity even, is presented to us as something where one must work hard, be dutiful to God, seek to do all of that first, and perhaps they might be accepted by God. And I believe Her Majesty this morning shows us it was exactly the other way around. It is to know, to have knowledge of, to fear, if you like, to remember God, and everything else flows from that. You see, we are powerless to keep His commandments. We see that all through the Scriptures and all through human history. But by knowing Him, by living in His service, not only does it become possible, becomes desirable, becomes a way of life, and it ends up leaving a legacy which is glorious on earth and in heaven. Presidential historian Alvin S. Felsenberg says that the Queen was equally at home talking about her mutual love of horses with President Reagan, but also putting a usually solemn and somber Richard Nixon at ease, even at times making him look mirthful. I put to you, with Nixon, that was a true gift indeed. As we remarked upon, she served up till the very end. None of us, when we saw those pictures this week of her confirming an outgoing PM and receiving what would be her final Prime Minister and allowing them to form a government, I don't think any of us thought the end was quite as close as we thought it was. Remarkable public service, dedication, and duty which flowed out of her knowledge and her trust in God. You see, the language the preacher uses, fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. That word might be one of the most copiously used words through this time, this period of mourning, and indeed through Her Majesty's funeral, because she lived for duty. It characterized her. In many ways, it summed up her approach to everything that she did. And there have been times, even in my lifetime, where the very idea of monarchy has been considered and weighed as something that may be deeply outdated and have passed its best and be evolving into something completely different because of its irrelevance. And many of us will also recognize those words as being something that is often remarked upon about Christianity itself. Is that the case? Rather than that being the case, I believe that particularly Her Majesty's sense of duty and the way she conducted herself has something of critical relevance to our time, just as I believe the preacher's words stand outside of all time and place. You see, our world is now one that is characterized, much for the good, by rights, by individualism. And while we celebrate the progress we have made, that different people groups and many individuals now do have their rights recognized, like anything in the history of the world, these advances and that progress can have an excess, where we become so obsessed with rights that we forget responsibilities, where we become so enamored with our individual path and destiny that we fall into a kind of collective narcissism and forget that we are supposed to be a collective and a society. And the monarchy actually symbolizes that quite well. And when we have a sovereign as dutiful as Her Majesty, she helps lead by example what it is to consider one's duty to others before one's personal preferences. She has left an entire life and record of the attractiveness of fulfilling duty. Duty is a word we barely hear. Sometimes we don't resonate, and it's definitely not held up as a value now. Might it be that the time has come to bring it back in light of the beautiful legacy left by Her Majesty? All the good in her life flowed from knowledge of the Creator and remembering Him, not the other way around. Verse 14 of Ecclesiastes 12 concludes with, yes, a warning, but also possibly a source of great hope, to fear God and keep His commandments, because the Creator will bring everything into judgment, whether good or evil. This morning, as we consider Her Majesty's life lived out in accordance with fearing God and keeping His commandments, we live in hope and faith that as she has now passed from this earthly realm, that she is with the Lord that she loved so much, and that she hears the greatest accolade that any of us can live to hear. Well done, thou good and faithful servant, enter into the joy of thy Lord. Let me conclude this morning, having considered the fear of the Lord, what it is to remember Him for all our days, what it is to live in service and in duty to Him first, and then to others, empowered by His Spirit to keep His commandments, with a few words from Her Majesty, which I believe sums it up beautifully. This is from her Christmas message in the year 2000. To many of us, our beliefs are of fundamental importance. For the teachings of Christ and my own personal accountability before God provide a framework in which I try to lead my life. I, like so many of you, have drawn great comfort in difficult times from my Lord Christ's words and example. May God bless to us His word this morning, and enable us to live in service and in duty to him. Amen. We respond to him